Welcome to VSOW. We dig deep, so you don't have to. Today's deep dive. It's going to take us on a journey through the history of globalization.
Okay.
We've got a stack of research and articles
Yeah.
suggesting that this interconnected world we live in
Right.
is not a recent phenomenon, but rather a recurring pattern woven into the very fabric of human history.
Yeah, it's
Fascinating.
it's fascinating how the perception of globalization as a modern invention is so widespread. But if we look closely, we can find evidence of global interconnectedness, stretching back millennia,
Right.
influencing everything from our cuisines to our cultures.
Okay, so let's start with something relatable.
Okay.
Imagine you're in your kitchen, cooking a meal.
Yeah.
You've got tomatoes from Italy, spices from India,
Mhm.
maybe even chocolate from South America. It's so easy to take this global pantry for granted.
It is, and that's partly why the historical depth of globalization gets overlooked. We're so accustomed to this globalized existence that we rarely stop to consider its origins. Take the Columbian Exchange, for example.
Yeah.
While it's a significant event, it's often presented as the starting point of globalization,
Right.
when in reality, it's just one chapter in a much longer story.
So are you saying that even before Columbus, the world was already experiencing significant cultural exchange?
Think about the Silk Road, a network of trade routes that connected East and West for centuries.
Wow.
It facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, religions, and technologies, leaving a lasting impact on the cultures it touched. This kind of interconnectedness wasn't an anomaly. It was a recurring theme throughout human history.
But if that's the case, why do we have this persistent notion of distinct, isolated cultures? You know, the idea that Italian culture is purely Italian
Yeah.
or Chinese culture is purely Chinese.
It's a fascinating paradox. While cultures are constantly evolving and adapting, absorbing influences from the outside world, there's this tendency to view them as static and pure. The concept of globalization is key here. It describes the process where global products and ideas are integrated into local cultures, transforming them over time. Eventually, the global origins are obscured, leading to a sense of cultural uniqueness that may not entirely reflect reality.
So it's like a cultural chameleon,
Yeah.
adapting and blending in until its origins become almost invisible.
Precisely. Hummus, for example, is enjoyed globally, but each region has its own variations, making it seem like a purely local creation. The Moroccan version might be spicy, the Greek version lemony, and the American version perhaps roasted red pepper.
Interesting.
Over time, these variations become so ingrained in local culinary traditions that the global origins of hummus are forgotten.
That makes sense. And it seems like this applies not just to food, but to all aspects of culture.
Hmm.
Are you suggesting that even national cuisines,
Mm-hmm.
often seen as symbols of unique cultural identity,
That's
are actually products of centuries of global exchange?
While cooking is a universal human behavior, the specific ingredients, techniques, and flavors that define a particular cuisine are often the result of historical interactions with other cultures. Take Italian cuisine, often celebrated for its use of tomatoes. Yet tomatoes are native to the Americas, only introduced to Europe after the Columbian Exchange.
Oh, wow.
This seemingly quintessentially Italian ingredient is actually a testament to global interconnectedness.
So what you're saying is
No?
that the very things we consider markers of cultural authenticity are often products of globalization.
Exactly. The idea of pure, untouched cultures is often more myth than reality. It's a fascinating contradiction, considering that many of the things we value most, from the foods we eat to the ideas we cherish, are often the result of cultural exchange and adaptation.
But doesn't that raise some interesting questions about the concept of cultural appropriation? If cultures are constantly borrowing and adapting from each other,
That's a complex issue, and one that's hotly debated today. It's important to remember that cultural exchange isn't always a benign process. There's a difference between respectful adaptation and exploitative appropriation. Understanding the nuances of this history helps us navigate these sensitive conversations in a more informed way.
it seems like the more we delve into this, the more we realize that globalization is not just about economics or trade. It's about the very essence of what makes us human.
Precisely. It's about the inherent human need to connect, to exchange, to explore, and to adapt. And these impulses have been shaping our world for far longer than we often realize.
It makes you wonder then, why there's so much anxiety around globalization today? If it's been such a constant throughout history, why are we so concerned about it now?
Perhaps because the pace and scale of globalization have intensified in recent times. Technology has accelerated the flow of information, goods, and people, creating a sense of rapid, even overwhelming change.
Right.
It's understandable that some people feel a sense of unease or disorientation in the face of such rapid transformation.
And that unease is often exploited, isn't it? You hear calls for deglobalization,
Yeah.
a return to national identities, a rejection of the interconnected world.
It's a recurring theme throughout history. When faced with complex challenges, there's often a temptation to retreat into the familiar, to seek comfort in a romanticized past. But as we've seen, that past is often more complex and interconnected than we remember.
So how do we reconcile this long history of interconnectedness with the anxieties and uncertainties of our present moment? What can we learn from all this?
Perhaps the most important lesson is that globalization is not some external force acting upon us. It's a process that we've been shaping and reshaping for millennia. And understanding that history can empower us to navigate the challenges of the present in a more informed and nuanced way.
Instead of fearing globalization, we can learn to embrace its complexities and see it as an opportunity for greater understanding, connection, and even progress.
Precisely. By acknowledging our shared human story and recognizing that we are not so different from them, we can start to build bridges instead of walls, fostering a more inclusive and harmonious world.
That's a powerful message, and a perfect place to pause for now. We'll be back in just a moment to continue our deep dive into the fascinating world of global interconnectedness.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the fascinating history of global interconnectedness.
Before the break, we were talking about this intriguing paradox, how we tend to perceive cultures as distinct and isolated,
Right.
even though history reveals a constant flow of exchange and adaptation.
And one of the most striking examples of this can be seen in the evolution of languages.
Oh, that's interesting. I've always been fascinated by languages. How does globalization play into their development?
Well, if you look at language families, you'll find remarkable patterns of divergence and convergence, reflecting centuries of human migration, conquest, trade, and cultural interaction. Take the Indo-European language family, for instance. It encompasses a vast range of languages, from English and Spanish to Hindi and Russian.
So you're saying all those languages share a common ancestor? That's mind-blowing. How did they spread so far and wide?
Through a complex interplay of factors, migration played a key role as ancient populations moved across continents carrying their languages with them. Conquest and empire building also contributed, as dominant groups imposed their languages on conquered populations. And trade routes, like the Silk Road we mentioned earlier, facilitated linguistic exchange, as merchants and travelers interacted with people from different linguistic backgrounds.
So it's like a linguistic tapestry,
Yeah.
woven from threads of human movement and interaction. And as these languages spread, they must have evolved and adapted, incorporating elements from other languages they encountered along the way.
Precisely. And that's where things get really fascinating. Think about English, for example.
Yeah.
It's a Germanic language at its core, but it's been heavily influenced by Latin, French, Norse, and countless other languages over the centuries.
Wow.
It's a testament to the dynamism and fluidity of language, its ability to absorb, adapt, and transform through contact with other cultures.
But doesn't that challenge the notion of linguistic purity? I mean, if languages are constantly borrowing and evolving, can we even talk about a language being purely English or purely French?
That's a great question. And it highlights the limitations of thinking about culture in terms of purity or authenticity. Languages, like cultures, are living, breathing entities that are constantly evolving and adapting. The idea of a pristine, untouched language is largely a myth.
So instead of lamenting the loss of linguistic purity, perhaps we should marvel at the richness and diversity that comes from this constant exchange and adaptation.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that languages, like humans, are interconnected and interdependent. The evolution of one language often influences the development of others, creating a web of interconnectedness that spans the globe.
And it's not just languages, is it? This pattern of global exchange and adaptation seems to play out in all aspects of human culture, from technology to art to religion.
Precisely. Think about the printing press, for example. It was invented in Europe, but its impact was felt worldwide, revolutionizing the spread of knowledge and ideas. Or consider the influence of Islamic art and architecture on European styles during the Middle Ages, demonstrating how cultural exchange can transcend geographical boundaries and historical periods.
So if globalization is such an integral part of the human experience, why do we often view it with suspicion or fear? Why are we so quick to focus on the negative aspects like economic exploitation or cultural homogenization?
That's a complex question, and there are no easy answers. Part of it might be the speed and scale of contemporary globalization, which can feel overwhelming and unsettling. The rapid flow of information, goods, and people can create a sense of disorientation,
Really?
leading some to yearn for a simpler, more familiar past.
And that yearning for the past is often exploited by political movements that promote isolationism, nationalism, or a return to some imagined golden age. But history shows that those golden ages are often more myth than reality. They tend to ignore the complexities and inequalities that existed, even in supposedly idyllic times.
Exactly. It's crucial to remember that history is not a linear progression towards some utopian ideal. It's a messy, complex, and often contradictory process, full of both progress and setbacks.
So how do we navigate this complex terrain? How do we reconcile the undeniable benefits of globalization with the legitimate concerns about its potential downsides?
Perhaps the key lies in understanding that globalization is not some predetermined force, but rather a process that we shape and are shaped by. It's up to us to ensure that globalization benefits all of humanity, not just a privileged few.
And that requires a nuanced understanding of history, doesn't it? We need to look beyond the simplistic narratives of us versus them or good versus bad to recognize the shared humanity that underlies our interconnected world.
Exactly. By acknowledging the complexities of the past, we can better equip ourselves to address the challenges of the present and build a more just, equitable, and sustainable future.
This conversation has been incredibly insightful, but we've barely scratched the surface of this vast topic. I'm eager to hear more about how this historical perspective on globalization can help us navigate the challenges of our modern world. We've been talking about globalization as this constant force throughout history, shaping everything from the languages we speak to the foods we eat. But what about the challenges it presents? How do we deal with things like cultural appropriation or anxieties about homogenization?
Well, that sense of unease you mentioned earlier, it often stems from a perceived loss of control. The rapid pace of globalization can make people feel like their identities are being eroded, their traditions trampled.
And that's where
Allegedly.
a general crisis of the 17th century you mentioned earlier comes in,
Right.
right? Was that a similar reaction to rapid change on a global scale?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a fascinating parallel. Back then, you had a confluence of events, climate shifts, economic upheavals, political instability.
Mm-hmm.
It created this widespread sense of fear and uncertainty, a feeling that the world was on the brink of collapse.
Sound familiar? Definitely. We see echoes of that today with climate change, economic inequality, political polarization.
Yeah.
It's like history is rhyming, even if the specifics are different.
And just like in the 17th century, there were calls for a return to a simpler past, for stronger borders, for a rejection of foreign influences.
Right.
But history shows us that isolationism rarely solves problems. It often exacerbates them.
So how do we move forward? How do we harness the benefits of interconnectedness while mitigating the risks?
It starts with understanding, recognizing that globalization is not a zero-sum game, where one culture wins at the expense of another. It's about finding ways to coexist, to share, to learn from each other without erasing our unique identities.
Easier said than done right, especially when you have powerful forces pushing for homogenization,
Absolutely.
for a world where everyone consumes the same products, watches the same shows, thinks the same thoughts.
But here's where understanding history becomes so crucial. It reminds us that cultures are not static entities. They've always been evolving, adapting, absorbing influences from the outside world. And in that process of exchange, something new and vibrant often emerges.
So it's not about clinging to some idealized notion of purity, but rather embracing the messy, dynamic reality of cultural evolution.
Precisely. Think about the fusion cuisines that have emerged in recent decades. They're a testament to the creative possibilities of globalization, a blending of flavors and traditions that creates something entirely new and delicious.
That's a great analogy. And it applies beyond food, doesn't it? Think about music, fashion, art, all these areas where global influences are constantly intersecting, sparking new forms of expression.
Exactly. And while some might lament the loss of traditional forms, I see it as a sign of vitality, of cultures continuing to evolve and adapt in response to the changing world.
But that adaptation doesn't have to mean homogenization, right?
Absolutely.
There's a difference between sharing influences and erasing distinctions.
The goal is not to create a bland, uniform global culture. It's about fostering a world where diverse cultures can coexist and interact, enriching each other without losing their unique identities.
So it's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where we can celebrate our differences
Precisely.
while recognizing our shared humanity.
And that's where the power of understanding history comes in. by recognizing the interconnectedness of our cultures, the shared threads that bind us together. We can start to build bridges of understanding and empathy.
That's a powerful message to end on. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful, and I hope our listeners have gained a new appreciation for the long and complex history of globalization.
It's a topic that deserves much deeper exploration, and we encourage everyone to delve into the fascinating research and articles available on this subject.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share with your friends. Your support helps us keep bringing you these deep dives into the world of knowledge.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Thanks for listening to VSOW.